Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Min Ed Soda. This is Kip Link. I am the Duffer. I'm joined by my colleague, the Dr. Todd Van Erp, and we've got history being made again with our guest for a second time. This guest is making history. Not only was he our first two-time guest, he's our first three-time guest. That's right, three. Trey. We welcome Troy Haugen from Lakes Country Service Co-op again this morning. Todd, Troy, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, Kip. I've been looking forward to this for weeks since I initially reached out to Troy as the let me back up a little bit. So Troy's position at Lakes Country Service Co-op is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Director of College and Career Readiness.
Career and college. We always talk about careers before we talk about
thank you. And then Troy is also the coordinator for the Minnesota Rural Education Policy Fellowship. So I've had the opportunity to be a part of that fellowship this year. It has been an amazing experience, and I would put in a plug for anybody that is interested in learning more about policy, about how policy gets made in the state and at the federal level. If you are interested in learning more about this and you are in the field of education, you need to reach out to Troy. This guy is a wealth of information. He will not admit it, but he is a wealth of information. So for me, it's just been interesting to learn more about the process, and it has really made me think more about, as a citizen and as someone who's in the field of education, how can I be more involved in the policy process? And one thing that I've learned this year is that process is this is available for everyone. And it's like a lot of things as citizens, we learn about it in school, but then you have to be proactive in navigating the system of policy, if you would call it that. And it's there for all of us to be involved. And a lot of times it might not turn out the way that we want it to turn out, but it's important that our voices are heard. And that's what democracy is all about. So that's why I'm thrilled that Troy is here this morning. So
I'm not going to lie, Todd. I was more excited a week ago than I am today. And it's not because of Troy. Today is Friday, May 27th. And 1 week ago, it looked like we potentially were going to have a ton of things to talk about. There was a framework on the table between the governor and the House leaders and the Senate leaders here in Minnesota. And then Sunday night came and went, and none of it came to fruition. So I was a lot more excited 1 week ago than I am today. So not, like I said, it's not about Troy. It's about our dysfunctional government.
I'm right with you, Kip, because it's frustrating when there's they've been in session for how long, Troy?
February.
So there's been all of this time. There's been all of these, bills that have been brought forward, and there's been all kinds of committee hearings and all this stuff that has gone on. And then we get to the end of the session, and it's just it's like big letdown because nothing happened. So, that is the frustrating part about democracy.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think all of us are a bit frustrated, and, frustrated might even be an understatement about kind of the letdown of the work that the legislature was supposed to have done. We have to remember the context too. The bigger picture here is and whether this is right or wrong, it's the honest truth is that it's not. This legislative session was a bonding or policy year, is what they typically call it. There's no budget that was required to pass. They literally could have gabbled in and gabbled out in one day, and ultimately could have been just fine. We would have been just fine. We have to remember the biggest context here is that the 2022 election is what this entire session was about. One of the heuristics that I was talking about in the policy fellowship is legislators' number one job is to get reelected. And although, there's a ton of legislators that are retiring or are not running for reelection, that doesn't mean that they're not involved in that reelection process, in that election process, because their messaging, their strategies still impact significantly power, and the control of that House, that Senate, and that governor's seat. So it's I think what we witnessed at the end of the session with basically, well, we know nothing really was accomplished, nothing went across the line with education. There was no omnibus bill. There were no standalones. It's a result of really election politics. There might be people that would disagree with me, and so be it. But there was a lot of all those committee hearings, all of those conversations provided the opportunity for a lot of good talking points and audio clips and video clips for re-election. So it's a mess.
Well, and the other frustrating thing for me, Troy, this is personally, is there's 9 billion reasons for them to act, right?
Yeah, that's the message. Remembering too that not all 9 billion of those dollars are hard dollars. Some of those dollars are required to go into reserve by state law. Some of those dollars, and I think we also have to remember that a lot of those dollars are a result of Minnesota's economy being strong over the course of COVID. And I would argue there's a lot of supplanting from federal dollars through those three federal packages, through CARES Act, CRSA, and ARP, that really supplanted some of states' responsibilities and padded that $9 billion budget. So I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but that $9 billion figure can change really fast when we know that all of our state revenue is based on tax and economy. And it's a campaign ploy. It's a campaign conversation that, how many times there's one side of the aisle going to say that $9 billion still sits in the state coffers, and one side of the political aisle will speak of that as a positive thing, and one side of the political aisle will speak of that as a negative thing. It's a game.
Yeah. And, Todd was talking about the 9 billion reasons. And it's not a financial year, right? Like in terms of how our government is set up in a biennium, 2-year cycles, and year one is the budgeting year and the finance year for the full biennium. And then, like you said, year two tends to be a policy or bonding thing, except when you have this $9 billion, billion with a B, right? I think people, I think there was finally a lot of hope in Minnesota schools that we could get rid of that special ed cross subsidy. Right? And for people that don't know what that is, I mean, I'm guessing anybody that's actually listening to our show knows what that is, because our 10 listeners are all leaders in Minnesota typically. But it is that concept of, the special education has been an unfunded mandate both at the federal level and the state level, and schools are having to take out of their general fund to cover their special ed costs. They're, even in it, when the special ed costs that are reimbursed are on about a 2-year delay, right? So it's a long time before you see this money that you're spending to give an equitable education to a kid that is being identified with some type of disability. And I think it's just super frustrating that there was $9 billion there, and some districts are into the millions of dollars in cross subsidy. Now, when I say millions, those are our very large districts, right? Like the Anoka Hennepins, maybe Elk River, some of those really large districts that they're into the millions, but it takes a significant part of the budget from our small rural schools too.
So I think 2 things with that. Again, I'm not disagreeing with you one bit. I would argue that it's not it's an unfunded mandate. I think it's an underfunded mandate. There are fiscal resources that are intended to, and have always been intended to pay those costs for special education services. The federal government is the one that has primarily not stepped up to the responsibility. You know, when IDEA passed, there was the notion that it was always going to be federal was going to cover at least 40% of the expenditures. Well, they've never gotten that far. If I remember, we're maybe in the teens or you know, so the federal government, which again, IDEA is the authorizing federal legislation for special education services to happen. And I think the other piece too that I think we're forgetting about in this conversation, and Todd and I had an opportunity in March to sit in the same space as the acting assistant secretary of education, Katie Nice, from U.S. Department of Education, and one of the concerns that we talked a little bit about is, let's say we quote unquote fully fund special education services. My biggest concern, I think there is a large concern about what we already have a little bit of an over-identification problem. And with over-identification, is there now a further incentive to continue to over-identify students for special education services? Now, again, I'm not saying that we should not be closing the cross-subsidy gap. I think there is certainly space to do that cross-subsidy gap reduction. 100%. There should be some conversation about. There should be some policies in place, but I think we also have to think about this from a bigger picture. There are districts and there are schools that over-identify significantly, but I think that's a symptom of a larger issue too. I think they are over-identifying not because they want to provide, you know, that they want to over-identify. I think we just don't have the support systems in place for students that perhaps don't qualify for a special education services in a way that is intended to. So that's a symptom of a larger problem. We don't have support systems in place oftentimes for students that don't necessarily that fall in those gaps. And we're probably getting a little too far deep into the weeds around policy, but it's a complex issue, and it's not as simple as just saying, oh, we've got $9 billion. It's going to take 400 million to, I'm making that number up. It's going to take $400 million a year to close that cross subsidy. So let's just close it. I think there's a larger policy conversation that really needs to happen. That really hasn't been happening.
Well, and you know, to be fair too, and not rip on politicians for this whole podcast, right? Like you also can't pay your bills with your savings account, right? And that's what this $9 billion really is at this point. I mean, it shows that we brought in more tax revenue than we were expecting, but we don't know that will continue over time.
Exactly.
And so we can't. I mean, I get that they can't necessarily commit to things over a long term, but they could over. You know, I mean, they could maybe for multiple years say, you know, we're going to take $1 billion spread out over 5 years, 10 years, right? To help close this. So, I mean, I have to acknowledge that, like, this is not, we can't expect our politicians to be committing to long-term expenditures, and they probably also can't necessarily go to long-term tax cuts either, because it would have been nice for our those that collect Social Security to not be taxed on their Social Security, because essentially,
absolutely.
I mean, again, we'll get a little political, but that they're being double taxed, right? Like they were taxed on that money once.
Yep.
Exactly.
See, I can
that was part of it.
I can play both sides of the aisle.
But that's, I mean, honestly, that's what we have to be having. We have, you know, if we're really going to create a culture of legislation or legislating and governance, that we have to be able to have those conversations. I spent some time in DC subsequent to the time Todd and I were there. I was invited to be a part of of a leadership institute that was, it was the think tank is right leaning. It was, I intentionally chose to become a participant in that because I need to really see big picture pieces from all sides. And one of the things that I came out of that conversation, that couple days there, was I think we conflate politics and partisanship way too much. You go back to the beginning of, all of these things, is what the definition of policy that we operate in the Policy Fellowship is. A policy is a course of action for a given period of time based on a given set of circumstances intended to influence future decisions and actions. So it has to have all those components. It's a course of action. It's really for a given period of time. It's based on the current set of circumstances, and it's intended to influence the future. So policy, what we're talking about are policies here. Cross subsidy, filling in the bucket for the cross subsidy is a course of action. It's based on this given set of circumstances, and we have to think about that in a given period of time. Do we really have the ability to do this forever? And maybe not. And then the politics around that, politics is not about whether you're on the right side of the aisle or the left side of the aisle. Politics is the strategy to implement policy or to agree upon policy. What we are conflating with that politics, I think, is partisanship, and that's that political dogma. That's the dogmatic beliefs of a political party, and I think we forget that those are really two different things. The dogma, the beliefs, and the strategy to get policy defined and implemented are two different things. You can't separate them oftentimes, especially in our current system, and we're experiencing that right now because we have no deal. But we have to remember that those are very different things. If that makes any sense.
It does. And actually, one of the things that it makes me think of is what we talked about right before we started recording, was Minnesota is the only state in the country right now that has a divided government. Like, if they've got both a House and a Senate, in every other state, either the Republicans have it all or the Democrats have it all. Minnesota, our Senate is got a majority party by the Republicans. Our House of Representatives here in Minnesota, the Democrats have the majority, and then our governor obviously is a Democrat here in Minnesota. And so that divided government has actually created a very unique circumstance that we talked about. Like, Governor Walz is about to complete his first term without a single veto. And that's because of anything that actually gets to him had to clear the Republican Senate and the Democratic House. And so there was bipartisanship. So it may appear like at times that like nothing got done, but anything that did get done through those two legislative branches made it to the governor and was signed because it was so bipartisanship. Bipartisan, not bipartisanship, bipartisan.
We know what you meant.
Yeah, right.
By the time it got to the governor, right? Like that, it almost is like that is actually real governance, right? Like, what are the common things that we can totally all agree on, and that gets done?
If 2022 was not an election year, and where all House and all Senate members were not up for re-election, including the governor as well, and this, basically the entire state government is up for re-election, I think we would have seen some significant policy changes this session. And probably some really good ones because of exactly what you just said, Kip. Strong negotiations through the political process. Even though it's partisan, it was still a political process, a strategy to get policies defined and implemented. But we've got this election thing that's looming which then becomes more partisan than political.
So as we look back over this session, really, I mean, there really is, in terms of education policy changes, there's really nothing.
No, no, nothing, and I haven't looked through all of the bills that actually got to the governor's office and signed clearly, but no, I mean, there was no omnibus bill, there were no standalone bills. The tax bill would be the next most important piece as far as this education space is, and there wasn't a tax bill that came across the finish line either. So yeah, there really isn't anything.
Now, having said all this, true, I said there's nothing that may impact education. That could be wrong. There's a possibility that teachers are going to be part of the heroes pay,
Right, exactly, right.
which
That's
did pass.
right. That's true. Yeah, and that's we know that that's a short-term policy, and that's a short-term financial bump. But yeah, I don't think it necessarily impacts how. I might be wrong, but I don't necessarily know how it impacts long-term standing policy in education. But you're
And
absolutely
it's not.
right.
I mean, it's up to like $750, which I mean, like a one-time $750 check is nice to receive, but it's not like true.
Foundationally changing your life.
Yeah, it's
Right.
not life-changing money. It means that you might get to, fix something at your house.
Right.
Maybe.
with inflation prices, stuff like that, probably not very much.
Yeah, you can buy a few 2x4s with and some decking material with
Well,
$750.
I
But
was going to say it actually might be your deductible on your insurance payment from all the storms that have come through Minnesota recently.
Right.
People that are getting new roofs or other things, it might cover their deductible so that they're not having to go into their own savings account to pay their deductible. But
True. Touche. Yeah.
I don't. I'm going to shoot a question at you here, Troy. And as you were talking about the legislative session, I mean, obviously the big story in the nation this week has been the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And you remember when we were having our policy fellowship meetings, how does policy get changed? Well, one of those things is, I remember you talking about the policy window, so basically there's got to be an appetite for change. There's got to be some push for change. And then there's got to be this window. And, based on the events that happened this last week and in previous weeks, is this a policy window for implementing some type of laws that will prevent this from happening in the future?
I've been thinking about that a lot. And it's I've got kids in school. I dropped them off right before we started recording this. My youngest are first graders, their last day of first grade today. And I've been in this business long enough to go from doing 9 fire drills a year to splitting those between fire drills and lockdown drills. And so to the question of, do we think the policy window is open? It might have already closed. I'm afraid it might have already closed. The partisanship side of this conversation is what opens and closes things really quickly. You've got one side of the partisanship aisle that is doing everything they can to keep this policy window open. And you've got one side of the partisanship aisle that is doing everything they can to close it as quickly as possible. And I think if I'm not convinced that the window is opened completely. I'm not convinced that the window is open still, simply because I think we've become. This news has almost continued to satiate. I think the political, or I would say just the citizenry of the country, because it happens too frequently, way too frequently. We've become numb to it. The true test is honestly going to be in November, and how the results of the election play out. I'm I'm not typically always a pessimistic person, but with this one, you got to follow the money.
Well, and
Uh,
in here, yes,
Yes.
I mean, it's in federal government, right? It's always follow the money, left, right, independent, right?
it's
Follow the money, always.
state
I would say
government.
state
Big
government
government.
too.
But here's my frustration is they treat this as if it's an or, right? Like it's
Yes.
it's mental health or it's gun laws, when in all reality it's an and,
Yep.
right? Like we have to do something about both of those. I mean, and with Uvalde, everything is we're still getting all kinds of information. But when our police officers are not sure if they can invade yet, or have a tactical team go because they're afraid of they themselves being shot, right? Which very real. I'm not criticizing the police on that. I get that, but then like, how can we say, oh, we should arm teachers, right? Like, here's somebody that's highly trained, and they have this very real and natural fear of being shot, right? Like, I mean, and there are plenty of heroes here that will run in and do those different things. I mean, police officers, parents. So again, this is not to be political, but that we've treated this as a complete or. Like, we can throw money at mental health, or we can do this, and then you get your two sides that are they pick their side instead of where's the and. And that's what I mean. That's what I really appreciate about Minnesota government over the last 4 years is it had to be an and.
Mhm. I 100% agree, Kip. I think we live in the tyranny of the or, and that stops us from doing almost anything because we make it an or. I also think we have not, as a nation and people individually within this nation, have not grappled with the root problems. I think we've ever really identified what the root problems are. Shooting in Texas and all of the other places that's unfortunately happened over the last several years, I think are symptoms of larger problems. And I think we've got the tyranny of the or, that the two problems are mental health and guns. I think those are symptoms. I don't know, but I don't know what the root problem is. And we're not allowing ourselves to have those really tough conversations. Simply creating policies, those courses of actions based on a given set of circumstances, without actually getting to a root problem, just become solutions looking for problems, and they don't ultimately make any substantial change. But I don't know the answers, and I don't think anybody knows the answers, because we haven't been allowed to have the noise. The partisanship noise prevents us from actually having a conversation.
And to add to that, there's a egocentric part of the United States too, right? Like, everything is about us here in the United States, and we don't always recognize that we're part of a global economy and a global system. Like, like when COVID was occurring, right? Like, everybody was only like they were throwing stones at the left and at the right, or for this or that, and not like going like every other country in the world is dealing with this too. Or like gas right now, that's another one, right? Like, every country in the world is struggling with the gas supply because of the politics around Ukraine and cutting off Russia, right? Like, but they want to make it all about the United States, and that we're not always being open to the different things. Like, so if we talk gun control, right? Like, other countries have issues with mental health as well. Other countries have issues with gun laws and what works and doesn't work, but we don't ever open ourselves up to looking at what other countries do. We get so egocentric that, and I do agree that we are the best country on the face of the earth, but we have our flaws, right? Like, we're not perfect. We might be the best, but we're not perfect.
And I would go as far as to say we may be the best for some people, but not for everybody.
Yeah. Well, and I think much of those struggles that we have, I'm gonna sound like a pessimist in saying this, but it all keeps coming back to money and power. Those are the things that continue to hold us back from moving forward as a society to 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 deal with these situations around things like mental health, around guns. Um, there are people that have money, there's people that have power, and that the if it serves their interests, they continue to lean into those things to maintain that power.
Absolutely.
Well, and that, we probably got way deeper into the political weeds than I ever hope to go on a podcast.
Yeah.
But that's where I'm going to go back to. I mean, maybe we can wrap up this part of the conversation of like, that's been the beauty of Minnesota for the last 4 years, is everything was an and that we needed our Republican Senate and our Democratic House to like, where's our common ground, and we move. And maybe we don't move as fast as some of us want to move, but we move in a direction that a majority of Minnesotans want to move in because we found the common ground and they were willing to have conversations. And so I think you're right, Troy. It would have been awesome if this was not an election year and we're sitting with 9 billion in the coffers and trying to figure out what we can do with that, because I think our Republicans have some strong ideas around tax savings and doing some of those different things. And our Democratic Party has some great ideas around beefing up our schools and looking out for all Minnesotans, and each Minnesotan, that not letting some individuals get lost in the all.
Mhm.
And you and I, Troy, were talking about it before we lost Todd for a little while before we started recording, of just that the fiscal conservative tied to the social democrat, right? Like, where is that person in our society? Because that's how we'll actually get stuff done, because it appeals to a majority of our populace.
Yeah, I 100%. And I think too, we have to start to think and acknowledge the fact that our systems are right now built on a two-party only system, this two-party partisanship system, which it's been that way for a long time, and recognize that. However, I think the dogma around those parties have continued to expand beyond anything centrist, and yet the populist, I think, is generally in the center. It doesn't, if you listen to the news, it doesn't sound that way, but the people that scream the loudest are the ones that are most at risk of losing power.
Yes.
So that's what you're going to hear. The people that are in the middle don't scream, because they're typically not always as worried about losing power. But I think we need to start worrying about losing power, because that partisan divide is getting so great, and it's not reflective of its populace.
Yeah.
Well, we have been on for quite a while for a Friday. We got into the weeds, and maybe it's time to wrap it up.
Whatever you want.
Oh man. Yeah, I was really hoping, when we scheduled Troy to be on for today, we were hoping that we were going to have a lot of policy things to talk about and some exciting things happening. But unfortunately, our Minnesota legislature didn't help us out much. So we kind of got a big nothing burger out of it. So yeah.
Yep, you're pretty right.
Yeah. So, if there is a special session and if there are things that come out of that, Troy, would you be willing to come back and help us highlight some of those items? Because I think that would be great for our 10 listeners to be able to catch up on.
Absolutely, but I wouldn't count on a special session.
Okay.
That's my prognostication.
Okay.
Yeah, unless they can really get something larger than the framework hammered out, right? Like, because they kind of had that framework of this amount of money was going to go to permanent tax relief, this amount of money was going to go to schools. I think if they don't have the details, they're not coming. I mean, like if they don't have it where it's lock solid, like this is the plan. Um,
And I think some of that was a little bit of smoke and mirrors too, to be honest
Yeah.
with you. I think we're finding that out.
Yeah. And to be quite honest, I mean, I appreciate what Senator Miller said too, of like, we had 3 months to get our work done and we didn't. And that's on all of them. That's on the right and the left, right? Like this, that we have to go to a special session all the time as a Minnesota taxpayer is getting to be a little bit ridiculous at times because we pay them a per diem to come back for their special session when we already pay them for 3 months.
Yep, absolutely.
And that's a
Plus,
really,
we pay them
as a,
we pay them a salary plus a per diem.
yeah, as a school administrator, when kids don't get their work done during the school year, what do they have to do?
Stay and
They
get
come,
it done.
they come back for summer school and they don't get paid extra. You know, they have to come back and do the work, and you know, and if they don't, then they don't earn credit. So, you know, as kids, I'm sure kids are sitting there going, okay, so legislators, they don't do their work, and what's the ramifications for that?
They get paid more.
And the 2022 election. I think that's what we have to remember. You know, if we're not happy about it, we all have a vote. And I mean, it's plain and simple.
There you go, talking sense again, Troy Haugen. Jeez.
You're probably the only one person that tells me that I'm talking sense.
Well, then maybe we can remain friends. That would be good.
Okay, it works for me.
Okay. Well, Kip, let's wrap this baby up.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in for another episode of Min Ed Soda. For the doctor, I'm the Duffer. You can get a hold of us on Twitter with hashtag Min Ed Soda or at Principal Learner for Todd or at Kiplink. For me, we'd love to hear from you. Have a great day, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Be safe.
Thank you.